My name is Dusana Dorjee, and I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Education. I lead the WellMinds Lab, where we investigate the processes in the mind and brain underlying our mental health and well-being. We also study ways of fostering these processes in education to support mental health and well-being of children and adolescents. Today, I will be talking about training softer skills for well-being in harder times. We know that during the pandemic, mental health generally worsened, and this was certainly the case for children and adolescents. While in 2017, about 1 in 10 children and adolescents had a probable mental disorder, in 2020, it was 1 in 6, and this trend did not change last year. So what are the reasons behind the worsening of mental health in young people? Obviously, pandemic is a contributing factor. The illness, the social connection changes, the changes to the learning provisions all impacted negatively on the well-being of young people. But there are other reasons as well. For example, a recent survey across 10 countries showed that 59% of children and adolescents have very high levels of anxiety about climate. They are very or extremely worried about climate change. And they also report being feeling betrayed, feeling hopeless about the future. They feel that adults and institutions haven't done enough to address the current climate crisis. And this is further exacerbated by political polarization and by misinformation. And indeed, nearly half of young people in the UK see misleading content online every single day. But how can we move from understanding the trends of worsening in mental health of children and adolescents and the reasons behind this trend towards supporting young people effectively? This is where looking at the latest research that examined what protected our well-being and mental health during the pandemic helpful. So particularly they singled out some contextual factors and some psychological personal factors. And this research, for example, shows that those children and teenagers who had better online learning provision, they also had better mental health. In addition, those who were in families where there was less financial struggle during the pandemic, they also had better mental health. And similarly so, a sense of social protection was protective of mental health and well-being of young people, and parental mental health was closely positively linked to the mental health of children and adolescents. Now, amongst the personal and psychological factors, those who managed to remain optimistic still had a sense of hope. Those also had better mental health. And similarly, those young people who were better able to stay motivated, to structure their day, to regulate their emotions better, to regulate their attention, such as time spent on social media or time spent watching news better, those with better self-regulation also had better mental health. And similarly so, young people with greater sense of meaning in life and those able to spend more time in reflection, particularly in reflection in nature, those had better mental health. And finally, mindfulness, the ability to stay in the present moment and appreciate simple things in life, was also protective of their mental health and well-being. Now, interestingly, when we look at the list of these different characteristics, those personal psychological factors, together with a sense of social connection, can be clustered together based on two main well-being capacities. And we have been investigating these capacities in my lab. Importantly, these capacities can actually be trained. They can be developed through targeted training. And therefore, we can foster well-being skills in education, just like we are fostering skills of reading or math skills. So the first capacity I call the self-regulatory capacity, and it can be described as the ability to manage our thoughts, our attention, our emotions, our behavior in a flexible way, in an adaptive way, in line with our goals. And there is a lot of research suggesting that self-regulation in childhood strongly predicts both mental health and academic performance of children and adolescents, and even into adulthood, actually. So it is an important capacity to foster, both due to educational reasons and as a prevention of mental ill health. So how can we do this? How can we foster self-regulation in education? Studies show that effectively delivered training in personal and social skills can improve self-regulation. Similarly, so fostering a mindfulness-based approaches can help support self-regulation, and also exercise-based interventions, particularly if they also develop social skills. However, self-regulation is not enough. It needs to be complemented by another capacity, and I call this capacity the self-world capacity. It describes the locus of our self-identity, our sense of purpose in life, our sense of connection with others and the world. And I'm sure all of you can think of examples of how this sense of connection has been really important during the pandemic for our own health and for protecting of health of others as well. So how can we foster this capacity in education? We can, for example, embed training in empathy and compassion, characteristics that are closely linked to the self-world capacity. And importantly, we really should spend more time in education supporting young people in exploring their sense of purpose and meaning in life to counter this sense of hopelessness that they often report, to give them a sense of mattering, to tell them that they do make a difference, they can make a difference, and foster these capacities to do so through volunteering, through time spent in nature, through discussions about meaning and purpose in life, in literature, and through philosophy. So in the WellMinds Lab, we investigate how these two capacities can be modified by interventions in schools. And we particularly investigate changes in the processes of the mind and brain that are associated with such training. So particularly a lot of our research investigated modifications in the brain induced by mindfulness and well-being training. And what we have found was that there were particularly positive changes in brain indexes associated with self-regulation. And these are linked to activity in brain regions underlying self-regulation, such as the frontoparietal system, highlighted in yellow in this image, and in the cingular opercular system that is highlighted in purple here. We have found also some changes that link empathy with mental health in our studies, suggesting that sustaining empathic response might be protective of mental health in adolescents. And there is some research from adults suggesting that training in empathy and compassion can also result in tangible changes in the brain. And particularly in this study from Germany, they have found that training in empathy and compassion activates different parts of the brain, at least to some extent. Those in blue are highlighting the effects of empathy training, and those in red, the effects of compassion training. Now, importantly, some of these regions, again, also contribute to our ability to learn. So actually, effective learning is not separate from emotions, and involvement of emotions can actually support the transfer of learning into real world effectively. So looking at our education, are we doing enough to foster these two well-being capacities in our schools? And to answer this question, perhaps we can look at the current education policy and the current investment in mental health to support children and young people in education. And actually, majority of this funding is currently being spent on supporting children with existing mental health problems, and rightfully so. So we know that our mental health provisions are still lagging behind. Children and young people are not accessing the services fast enough. So we do need to invest into supporting those who have mental health problems. However, we also know that from a long-term perspective, prevention is much more cost-effective and much more effective in terms of supporting long-term well-being of children and young people. And we should pay much more attention to that in our education policy, in our investment. So particularly, we need to provide teachers with clear guidance on prevention programs. These days, we are pretty much asking teachers to be experts on everything, including being able to select the right mental health program or prevention program supporting well-being for their pupils. Similarly, so we are not providing teachers with enough guidance on how we can support mental health and well-being of children and adolescents systematically in an incremental way, just like we are training math skills or reading skills. And finally, the mental health and well-being of teachers is certainly a blind spot in the current education policy. There is research showing that stressed teachers have stressed students. We call this the stress contagion effect. So really, if we want to effectively support the mental health and well-being of students, we also need to support mental health and well-being of teachers. And yet, the latest statistics from education support show that 77% of teachers reports poor mental health, and 72% of teachers says that they feel stressed. So this really is an emergency that we need to address. And this approach of rethinking our way of supporting mental health and well-being in education is also reflected in the latest guidance on the new integrative curriculum provided by UNESCO. So they particularly suggest that we should foster in education 4 competencies which support mental health and well-being of children and adolescents. These are mindfulness and critical inquiry, which map very well onto the self-regulatory capacity. And the other 2 are empathy and compassion, which together with purpose link very well to the self-world capacity we have discussed. So how can we effectively support mental health and well-being of children and adolescents during these volatile times? Aside from addressing the contextual factors, particularly inequalities, we really need to rethink the excessive focus on academic assessment in our education. Surveys from teachers, parents, and pupils clearly show that they feel there is an overemphasis on assessments and not enough focus on fostering mental health and well-being in education. So we really need to focus more on prevention, on fostering the 2 capacities we have considered, and do so in a systematic, incremental way, just like we train the skills in maths or in reading. And we can do this effectively through implementation of whole school approaches that involve the range of environments where children are growing up in supporting their mental health and well-being. And here is the good news. The current education policies actually increasingly focus on implementation of whole school approaches. However, there still is the blind spot of supporting teacher mental health and well-being effectively in these policies. And finally, perhaps it is time to step back and look at the big picture. There are growing numbers of economists who highlight that the traditional economic models focusing on economic growth and profits are not sustainable anymore. They lead to overconsumption, and this is associated with poor mental health. As an alternative, they suggest focusing on well-being as the new purpose of economy. And perhaps this is where fostering of well-being capacities might be one of the possible ways of supporting mental health and well-being in education and in our society as we move towards this new purpose. Thank you.